The first snow had not yet fallen, but the cold was already a sharp personal thing. Elias knew this weather. He knew the silence it brought, the way it swallowed sound and left a man alone with his memories. This was his 91st winter in the isolated cabin, yet as he looked out across the skeletal forest, he saw something new. A phantom. A pure white presence on the edge of the tree line. Was it a trick of the light, a piece of wind-whipped snow that hadn't yet fallen? It sat perfectly still, a massive, unmoving feline shape of blinding white fur. It was a shadow cast by light itself, watching him. In that silence, an unexpected friendship was not only possible, it was essential. Now, let's enter their world. If you're already enjoying this story, a quick like and share makes all the difference. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. Elias's cabin was a fortress built against the world, though not by necessity but by choice. Its thick log walls and heavy slate roof had been his grandfather's, then his father's, and now, finally, his own. A sanctuary tucked deep within the cold spine of the North Woods. He was a man who had intentionally pared his life down to its absolute quiet minimum. His days were a precise ritual, splitting wood, mending fences, tending to the small, smokeless fire, and reading by the flickering lamplight. The truth, however, was that Elias's solitude was a heavy mantle, woven not from independence, but from a profound grief. His wife, Sarah, had passed 3 winters ago, and the quiet of the cabin had become a physical entity, filling every empty chair and unlit corner. He had the kind of grief that did not rage, but simply sat, heavy and constant, like a stone in his chest. It was a silent pact with loneliness, a refusal to replace the warmth that had gone out of his life. He had prepared for this winter just as he had the last, stockpiling dry wood and canned goods, meticulously sealing every window against the coming cold. But the cat changed the algebra of his solitude. The creature was enormous, a Maine Coon or something similar, he guessed, with a tail like a white plume and tufted ears. He saw it again the next morning, sitting precisely where it had been the day before. It was an impossible creature, too large, too white, too still to be a true wild animal. It appeared and disappeared on the periphery of his vision, always silent, always maintaining a perfect distance. He never saw it move, only reappear. He spent the whole day trying to find tracks in the thin layer of frost, but found nothing. He consulted his old, dog-eared wildlife guide. Nothing matched the cat's size or singular color. It was a beautiful impossibility, and Elias found himself, for the first time in years, deeply distracted from his routine. He began to watch the forest, not for the weather, but for the flash of white. His loneliness hadn't disappeared, but it had suddenly gained a companion, an unspoken question that hung in the still, cold air. A week passed in this silent vigil. Elias would look out, and there, Ghost, as he privately called the cat, would be, a bright, luminous spot against the dark firs. The cat never approached the cabin, never ventured into the clearing. Its presence was a boundary line it would not cross, a silent agreement of non-interference. Elias had accepted this. A wild thing had its instincts, and he had his grief. But the cold deepened, the air turning brittle, carrying the promise of the inevitable blizzard. Elias worried about the cat. A creature that large would need serious calories to survive the coming deep freeze. He remembered how Sarah used to leave out a small bowl of milk for the stray farm cats, a memory that tasted sharp and sweet. The small act of generosity suddenly seemed monumental, a risk to his carefully constructed walls. He found himself standing in the center of his kitchen, holding a piece of fresh-caught salmon he'd been saving. It was a sacrifice of his own comfort, a small yet significant offering of warmth into the cold equation of his life. With a deep breath, he walked out to the edge of the clearing, placing the fish on a smooth gray rock, a neutral zone between his world and the cat's. He did not look toward the trees. He did not wait. He simply returned inside, shutting the heavy door and retreating to his chair by the fire. He was acutely aware of the risk he had taken, not the risk of the salmon, but the risk of caring again. The next morning, the salmon was gone. There were no tracks leading to or from the rock, only a faint crystalline impression in the thin frost where the fish had rested. Elias felt a peculiar lightness, a small, unexpected victory against the heavy inertia of his winter routine. He continued the ritual every few days, leaving out a fresh piece of game or a bowl of heavy cream. It was a nonverbal conversation, a negotiation of terms carried out across the cold distance. Ghost remained elusive. Elias never saw the cat approach the rock, only watched the rock become empty. But the cat's presence at the tree line grew steadier, more predictable. It moved from the deep shadow of the firs to the trunk of a great weathered cedar, positioned where the afternoon sun warmed the bark. The distance was still vast, but the unspoken acknowledgment was growing. Elias would split wood, and the cat would watch. He would sharpen his axe, and the cat would remain motionless. One afternoon, a hawk swooped low, attracted by the smell of the cabin's smoke, circling over the woodpile where Elias worked. Elias didn't even notice the bird until he heard a sound. Not a growl, but a huff of air, deep and resonant, from the tree line. The sound carried no aggression, only immense authority. The hawk veered instantly, flying high and fast, disappearing over the ridge. Elias paused, leaning on his axe handle, and looked at the white cat. He realized with a sudden, warm shock that the cat was not just a recipient of his charity. It was a silent, powerful guardian of their shared space. The shift was subtle but profound. Elias began to speak aloud, narrating his day as he went about his chores. "Going to check the traps now, old friend," he'd mutter, or, "Seems like the south wind is bringing snow this time." He spoke not expecting a reply, but to fill the hollow silence with a voice that was no longer lonely, but acknowledging another presence. He never directed his gaze toward the cat, maintaining the respectful distance it seemed to demand. He started finding things, too. A perfect, intact feather left on his porch step. A cluster of rare winter berries placed neatly beside the woodpile. These small, quiet gifts were too precise to be random, too thoughtful to be the work of a wild scavenger. They felt like a thank you, an offering of the forest's own hidden beauty. The bond between them was a delicate tapestry, woven with silence, distance, and profound mutual respect. Elias understood that friendship wasn't always a matter of physical closeness. Sometimes it was simply the unwavering knowledge that you were not entirely alone in the deep, cold world. It arrived on the cusp of the new year, the blizzard. It began with an unnerving absolute stillness, a deep breath held by the entire forest. Then came the wind, howling down the ravines, an immediate, deafening force that ripped through the trees. Within hours, the world outside Elias's windows had vanished, replaced by a blinding, chaotic white. This was the North Woods showing its true, unforgiving nature. The storm lasted for 3 days. Elias was safe. His cabin a warm island in the churning sea of snow, but his thoughts were fixed on the perimeter. He knew what a storm like this did. It separated the careless from the survivors. He worried about Ghost, a creature of white camouflage suddenly rendered visible and vulnerable by the sheer force of the wind and the depth of the snowdrifts. On the second day, a blast of Arctic air extinguished his fire, and he was forced to spend hours carefully reigniting the flame, the smoke temporarily backing up into the cabin. When the wind finally relented on the third evening, Elias strapped on his snowshoes and stepped out. The air was colder than before, the silence now a pressure against his eardrums. The snow was chest-high in places, pure and untouched. He trudged toward the clearing where Ghost usually sat, his own fear a knot tightening in his stomach. He had risked his peace for this connection, and the thought of the cat, lying buried and frozen, was a heavy blow. He reached the base of the great cedar. It was a massive, silent monument, its lower branches acting as a small shelter. He cleared the snow with his gloved hands, digging into the small depression. He found no sign of the cat, only an empty, shallow depression in the frozen earth. A wave of familiar, crushing grief washed over him, the feeling of loss, the certainty that the brief, tenuous warmth of this friendship had been extinguished by the uncaring cold. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in resignation when he saw it. Not by the cedar, but on his porch. Nestled right beside the heavy oak door, out of the worst of the wind, was Ghost. The cat was curled into a perfect, massive, white orb. It looked up at Elias, its eyes twin emeralds in the twilight, and let out a soft, non-threatening chirp. It had moved from the forest to the human's shelter, choosing safety over distance, companionship over instinct. The cat hadn't just survived the storm. It had chosen to brave the final barrier to be close. Elias knelt in the snow, his old knees protesting the cold, but he barely noticed. He looked at the cat, and the cat looked back. Their distance finally closed, not by desire, but by necessity. The simple decision to be together against the violence of the world was a profound statement. Elias opened the door, and the cat did not hesitate. It rose, shook the light dusting of snow from its immaculate coat, and walked into the warmth of the cabin. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt momentous. It was the closing of a door on 3 years of unrelenting, self-imposed isolation. Elias watched as the massive cat walked directly to the hearth, turned around once, and settled down, its immense white form creating a beacon of soft, pulsing warmth against the dark flagstones. The grief that had been a stone in Elias's chest for so long suddenly shifted, cracked open by the sight of this wild, pure creature choosing to share his space. The cat didn't judge his loneliness. It simply absorbed it, replacing the hollow silence with the quiet, contented rhythm of its breathing. Elias sat in his chair, not reading, not mending, but simply watching. The cat's tail flicked gently, a small, trusting motion. He realized then what he had learned in the silence, that the deepest bonds are not forged through grand gestures, but through the small, constant acts of acknowledgment and shared vulnerability. The cat, Ghost, had come in from the cold, not seeking food, but seeking sanctuary, and in doing so had offered Elias the same. In that moment, the cabin stopped being a fortress against grief and became a home again. The cat stayed. It became a permanent, quiet fixture of the cabin. It never asked for attention, only proximity. It slept on the rug by the fire, chased sunbeams that fell through the window panes, and watched Elias with an unnerving, patient intelligence. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was full of the soft sounds of a life shared, the gentle purr of a sleeping cat, the soft click of its claws on the floorboards, the small, satisfied sigh when Elias knelt to stroke its thick, warm fur. Elias did not replace Sarah, but Ghost brought a new dimension to his life, a living, breathing reminder that life continues, that connection is possible, even when instinct and isolation suggest otherwise. The winter was still long, still brutally cold, but it was no longer lonely. It was a shared vigil, a quiet conspiracy between a man who had forgotten how to live and a creature who had come to remind him. We often search for meaning in the grand acts of humanity, in the loud pronouncements and monumental achievements. But the true medicine, the gentle therapy for a broken heart, is often found in the small, unwavering presence of another soul. It is in the knowledge that a wild creature, unburdened by human expectations, can choose to trust, can choose to stay. The cat that Elias called Ghost was not a phantom of his grief, but a luminous spirit of pure, unconditional company. And as the snow finally began to melt, Elias knew that the profound truth of that winter was this: grief is healed not by the absence of pain, but by the quiet, defiant presence of love. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this: do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.